Merely a couple of days after Randall Thor's epiphany at the top of Dragonmount, the Dark One finally unleashes a massive invasion upon the Borderlands. Hundreds of thousands of Shadowspawn swarm the kingdoms of Zaldea, Arfil, Kandor and Shienar simultaneously. Not long before that, General Rodel Ituralde had reached Maradon, the capital of Zaldea, to defend it following Rand's orders. However, the Saldeans view them as invaders and refuse them entry to the city. Ituralde is then forced to deploy his troops in two separate camps. One of them atop a fortified hill that defends the only ford in the Arenal River, and the other located downhill, closer to the walls. The force invading Zaldea descends from the Blight through the only mountain pass in the surrounding area, which leads directly to the ford guarded by Ituralde. The Trollocs cross the Arenal, but are met with a steadfast defending force set by the wolf, forcing the Shadowspawn to use the siege equipment that they had brought to breach the city walls way earlier than intended. Thus, they start to launch the bodies of their own dead over Ituralde's position, employing the 16 trebuchets in their possession. But that's just a diversionary tactic, for Drakkar are hidden among the falling bodies, surprising the defenders with this move. Ituralde himself kills one of them as the Ashaman begin to pull them back with fireballs. Alongside the Drakkar, the Trollocs lead another charge from the river. After a very even fight, Ituralde repels their attack, destroying in the process the enemy's whole set of siege equipment, although paying dearly for it, at the cost of many lives. Despite the initial success, eventually the Trollocs overrun the fortifications on the hill, forcing Ituralde to fall back to make a stand at the lower camp. After disbanding his unit there, sending the men far to the south, by the riverbank, he takes a defensive position with the remainder of his detachment from the hill fort, placing 3 ranks of pikemen, pointing their pikes towards the incoming Trollocs. Behind, a double line of archers begins to loose wave after wave on the Shadowspawn. This works as a delaying tactic for the rest of the army to retreat. Once the Trolloc advance is weakened, the Ashaman would take the burden of withstanding the attack, buying time for the pikemen and the archers to retreat. The pikemen work in a relay system in which the line who already killed Trollocs moves behind the second, and so on. The Ashaman wait away from the shooting range, accompanied by 2 lines of Saldean cavalry, the only remaining mounted troops that Ituralde still has left. Those inside Maradon are still reluctant to allow Ituralde in, so he plans to move past the walls, thinking that the enemy will surely besiege the city, giving time for Ituralde's army to take a defensive position in his next chosen spot, some 10 leagues south. However, at this point, in a fit of madness, Lidrin, Ituralde's lieutenant, breaks the pikeman line, surging forward with a cluster of men to fight the Trollocs. Ituralde yells at him to go back, but the men are on a frenzy and won't listen. Seeing the hole in the ranks, the Trollocs strike at them, scattering Lidrin's men and penetrating the defensive line. Ituralde, mounted on horseback, leads his personal guard to close the gap, fighting Trollocs himself. Suddenly, some of the trumpets sounded retreat, but it is way too soon, so not all of the trumpets join them, causing some of the pikemen lines to break formation, while others still stand, creating a disaster in the defensive position. Panicked, Ituralde orders one of his Saldean reserve cavalry lines to attack the center of the Trolloc advance, and the other to charge at their eastern flank, while he himself rode with his guard to aid the western flank. But right at that moment, the Murderal, who were waiting for the archers to run out of arrows, and for the Trollocs to soften the lines of men, joined the attack, leading also Drakkar into the charge, making a mess out of the defensive lines. The Ashaman tried to fend them off with fireballs, but after so many days fighting, they are tired and cannot produce a steady stream of fire. In spite of that, one of the Ashaman was able to sneak into the enemy position, burning down the second set of siege equipment that the enemy were assembling to the north. Dawnweave, Ituralde's horse, falls to a javelin to the neck, throwing the general to the ground, and even though he got a broken leg, he still manages to kill an approaching Trolloc, only to see a murderer coming for him. He takes up his sword, preparing himself to make a last stand, when suddenly the Fade is taken by several arrows. Ituralde is shocked to see many thousands of Saldean horsemen sweep through the ranks of Trollocs, taking them down entirely. He looks back to find that the gates of Maradon are now open, finally allowing Ituralde's remaining forces in. Iole, the leader of the Saldean cavalry relief force, personally meets Ituralde and takes him, alongside his few personal guards still alive, into the city, which, not long after, gets surrounded by a new wave of Trollocs, numbering well over hundreds of thousands of Shadowspawn. Thus, the siege of Maradon begins, while the wounded are healed by Ashaman, Ituralde included. A few days later, Ituralde inspects the besieging forces from the top of the northern wall, and just when one of the Ashaman was warning him that he could feel Saidin being channeled from the enemy camp, a massive blast hits the wall, breaking a huge hole in it and knocking Ituralde down, deafening him for a while. After being healed by an Ashaman, the general heads to the Kodamora Palace, the royal seat, where he could survey the area and establish a command post. However, he soon realizes the city is lost, since the explosion left a huge gap in the wall that would soon be breached by masses of Trollocs that were climbing into rafts to cross the moat. The only defense left was a hastily assembled group of shaken soldiers. Ituralde gives the order to retreat, but just before the Ashaman begin to weave the gateways, Captain Iole asks Ituralde to stay and prove what it means to be one of the great generals. Since the watchfires to the east are lit, meaning that aid is coming, Rodel decides to stay and do as much damage as possible to the Shadowspawn, while giving time for the reinforcements to come, if they come at all. He commands the Ashaman to replace the men at the gap in the wall and orders them to hold the breach for at least an hour, while he deploys the defense in a more organized manner. Iole runs to gather the Saldean soldiers that are running loose through the city, taken by panic, while the cavalry is formed up in the palace courtyard, divided in 4 companies, and every man able to fire a bow is summoned to Ituralde's command center. After the better part of an hour holding the breach, the Ashaman finally pull back, exhausted of blasting the Trollocs back with the one power. They leave the gap on the wall completely undefended, as Ituralde ordered. This was meant to make the Trollocs believe the battle to be already won. Thus, the Shadowspawn entered the city, intent on slaughtering the survivors. Carefully piled rubble blocking the streets guides the main bulk of the creatures down an avenue to the east side of the city, at the end of which the bowmen assembled by Ituralde were waiting at the balconies of the buildings at both flanks. As soon as the Trollocs approach, arrows rain down on them, while large crossbows fire huge bolts on the murderer leading them. After the volley, one of the cavalry units charges down the remaining Trollocs, taking advantage of the width of the avenue, finishing them off. All around the city, many similar bands use the same strategy, pushing the remaining Trollocs into the palace courtyard, where they get cornered, making them easy prey for the cavalry that tramples the creatures down. The few that survive make their way back to the gap on the wall, scrambling away from the city. Nevertheless, Ituralde knows the enemy is just regrouping for a new wave of attacks, so he orders his men to scatter through the city, picking different buildings to hide. The second assault saw hundreds of Trollocs and Murderol swarming the royal palace, but anticipating that, Ituralde had ordered the building to be packed with as much oil as could be found, so once the palace was full of Shadowspawn, the Ashaman set it aflame, instantly killing them with the explosion. However, the city is still full of enemies, so Ituralde resorts to guerrilla warfare tactics, hiding inside the buildings and ambushing isolated fists of Trollocs with bowmen and cavalry. But the number of Trollocs flooding the city is immense, so, being severely outnumbered, Ituralde loses communication with the other focuses of resistance, and after a few hours of fighting, his own numbers start to dwindle. At that moment, Davram Bashir arrives through a gateway, and, leading his force of Chaldean soldiers, he takes on the Shadow Spawn, cleansing the city. However, the Dark One was set on utterly breaking the spirits of men, so, not giving the defenders a brief respite, he sends a new wave of Shadow Spawn, many times larger than the original one. Several hundreds of thousands of Trollocs that make Bashir and Ituralde lose hope. They prepare to abandon the city altogether when Rance himself appears. He is so angered by the Dark One's intention that he goes by himself, only guarded by 2 maidens, to the field in between the city and the hillside fortifications, where he unleashes gargantuan amounts of the One power, creating a storm of light that rains fire, ice and lightning down on the Shadow Spawn. As a final touch, the Dragon Reborn also opens death gates, wreaking havoc among the Trollocs to such extent that they finally begin to retreat back to the Blight again. For now. Nonetheless, the sheer size of the invading force and the relentlessness of the Dark One have made something crystal clear. This was just the preliminary stage of Tarmon Gai'don, the last battle, which is about to begin. I am preparing myself to make the video pertaining to said battle, so if you like my content, please give me a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.